So thank you guys for coming out. And I just start and say I would stay away from the low-income housing tax credit business. And you might be thinking, who's this 30-year-old guy giving advice to someone that's way older, and why is this guy moderating the event? And you might be thinking maybe he selfishly wants to keep it for himself and the people in the know, or maybe even that this next hour might be a waste of your time. But what I can tell you is, if you do decide you'd like to get into the affordable housing business, then this panel has the battle scars, the know-how, and the track record to get your deal to a successful outcome. So my name is Sean Ballore, and I've worked in the affordable housing business since 2011 on projects in New York, California, Florida, Mississippi, and Puerto Rico. And I'll now just pass it on to the rest of the panel to introduce themselves. We can start with Courtney.
Hi, can you hear me? My name is Courtney Horowitz, and I have a company called Strata Ventures, LLC. And Strata is a consulting firm that consults to for-profits and nonprofits that are doing affordable housing deals. So a lot of tax credit deals, but also other kinds of affordable housing deals. And I came into this business because I spent 10 years working for a large affordable housing developer called Omni New York, doing LIHTC deals in all around New York City and outside of New York City.
My name is Kelly Bissinger. I am a partner at the law firm of Voorhees, Sater, Seymour, and Pease in our Washington, D.C. office. I have been working in the tax credit field for about 15 years. I primarily represent developers, but have represented syndicators and upstream investors as well. And I primarily work in the D.C. and Ohio markets, but do some deals in other parts of the country as well.
Good afternoon. My name is Stuart Portney. I'm the principal of the Metro Company. We are affordable housing consultants and developers. I'm the interloper here. I'm from New Jersey. But we've been in the affordable housing business, affordable housing space for over 30 years, and we have worked on every type of affordable housing project, from new construction to rehabilitation to conversion, family housing, senior housing, supportive housing. And our principal role on the projects that we get involved in is actually putting the capital stack together, putting all of the financing that's necessary in order to do these deals. As I mentioned, I've been doing this for over 30 years. I guess I'm the elder statesman on the panel, but I started when I was 12 years old.
Good afternoon. I'm Paul Connolly. I'm from R4 Capital. We are a low-income housing tax credit syndicator based here in New York City. I've been doing this for 20 years. My family still has no idea what a low-income housing tax credit syndicator is, and I marginally know. But we, after you've worked with everyone else on here and you actually have an allocation of low-income housing tax credits, we're the entity that buys those credits for you and provides you with the equity to renovate or construct the building. So we're the financing mechanism for LIHTC deals. We work nationally. We work on 4% deals. We work on 9% deals. And we also offer private placement of tax-exempt debt.
All right. Thank you, guys. So with that, during the discussion, we're going to go over what the LIHTC program is and what the risks are and what the benefits are of getting involved. And hopefully the goal of this conversation will be for you guys to take it, and if you're curious to learn more and you'd like to potentially get involved, you reach out to some of the folks up here to make that happen. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Stuart, and he's going to give you a high-level view of what the program is all about, if we can actually get the projector to work. We got? Okay, great. Awesome. Thanks.
So my job this afternoon is to really to give you an overview of the LIHTC, or the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. Since we're each been allocated about 10 minutes, I am going to be moving pretty quickly because there's a lot of material to cover, and I guess we will certainly have opportunity for Q&A after the presentations. So you can look at this as a tax credit primer or a tax credits 101. I saw there were some hands for folks that have some experience, but a lot don't. So hopefully this will give you a good overview. So what is the low-income, if you can switch the slide, so what is the low-income housing tax credit program? Essentially, this was a program that the Reagan administration started in 1986, so it's a very mature program. And one of the things the first thing I tell people about the tax credit program, or LIHTC, is that it's actually the single largest rental housing production program in the United States, and it's not run out of HUD. It's run out of the IRS, and that's called Section 42. And the fact that it's run out of Section 42 and IRS, Section 42 is the section of the code that it refers to, is it gives you some indication of how complex and arcane the program is, because it's not run out of a traditional housing agency. So what is the low-income housing tax credit? What it's not is if you can change the slide, it is not a tax deduction, which you are familiar with, okay? It is a tax credit. A tax credit is a dollar-for-dollar reduction in your federal tax liability. So, and we're going to go through some examples later on in the presentation about how tax credits factors into development finance. But essentially, the reason that the tax credit is such a powerful economic incentive is because it's a very significant way for you as a developer of an affordable rental housing projects to raise equity in the marketplace, to go to somebody like Paul and raise capital, cold hard cash, to put into your development deal. So if you offer an investor $1 million in tax credits for each and every year for 10 years, and Kelly is going to go into how the partnership is structured and what that all means, so I'll leave it at that for right now. If you offer an investor $1 million tax liability and their federal tax credit, and their federal tax liability is $1 million for that particular year, they actually pay zero in federal income taxes. So it's a very powerful tool. It's a significant investment vehicle to bring equity into your transactions. Thank you. So there are two basic types of tax credits. You might have heard they are the 9% annual tax credit and 4% tax credits. There's a little different flavors in the 4% tax credits, but essentially the 9% is known as the competitive tax credit, and under certain circumstances the 4% is the non-competitive tax credit. We're going to go through a simple calculation, so just right now understand that the reason the 9% is very competitive is because each state gets an allocation based on their population, and because you can raise between 70 and 80%, you'll see in our example, of equity in a development project. The 9% credit is very valuable, and it's something that's very competitive. States, even though it's run through the IRS, typically states through their housing or housing and finance agencies are the ones that administer the tax credit program, and they have what's called it's really the Bible. It's called the Qualified Allocation Plan, or QAP. And that sets forth all of the requirements that the state has established based on the Section 42 program. So the 9% credit is fixed. The 4% credit is a variable rate. And there's something called the non-competitive 4% tax credit, which effectively is available to you as a developer as of right. What that means is that if you utilize volume cap tax-exempt bond financing from the state housing agency, then you can secure the 4% tax credits as of right. Now, in certain situations, since you're raising less than half the amount of equity, as we will see through 4% credits, there are only certain types of transactions that could work with the 4%. So, for instance, typically doing ground-up new construction, most likely, not in all cases, but most likely you're going to end up wanting to access the 9% credit. So we're going to go through very quickly some basic definitions that will factor into our what we'll see soon on a capital stack. So total development costs are what you would anticipate. Those are all costs associated with the development of the project, all hard and soft costs, land, construction, all the cost of borrowing, your carrying costs, your professional fees, your financing fees, and of course your profit or developer fee. Eligible basis, that's a significant term in the tax credit universe, and that's essentially the value of the project that's recognized by the IRS. So for all intents and purposes, it's total development cost less certain costs that are not considered to be an eligible basis. Land is a big one. There are other costs like certain reserves, the cost involved in permanently operating the project, marketing expenses, working capital, that are also not eligible, and we'll see what that means in our calculation of credits. Depreciable basis is a terminology you're probably familiar with, and that's the value of the development that you can recognize and take deductions for depreciation, and that's something that Paul might get into in terms of how investors look at these transactions. We talked about thank you. If you talked about we talked about the credit rates, which is the 9% and 4% tax credit. The IRS allows an equity boost if the project is located in a QCT. That's a qualified census tract. That's essentially a low-income census tract, or if it's in a DDA, which is a difficult to develop area. And what that means is that the IRS has recognized that there are areas geographically throughout the country that it may be more difficult to do these development projects, and they allow you to take that 30% equity boost. There's something called the applicable fraction. It's just a fancy way of saying what's the percentage of affordable units within your development. So if you're doing 100% affordable housing development, there's a 100% applicable fraction. If you're doing a mixed income development, say 60% is affordable and 40% is market rate, then the applicable fraction is 60%. So we're going to quickly just get into some development numbers here, so that you'll see, as I started off by saying, why that tax credit equity is a very powerful tool to be able to finance these types of developments. We're going to assume in this particular instance that we have a project that say it's 60 units, $250,000 per unit, all in development costs. So we have a total TDC of $15 million. We're going to assume that land, say just $1 million, and another $500,000 in expenses that I mentioned that are non-eligible basis cost. That would mean that's another $500,000. So we have a total of $1.5 million that the IRS would not recognize in the eligible basis calculation. So that means we have a $13.5 million eligible basis in this example. We do not have a 30% basis adjustment for QCT or DDA. The basis, that means our adjusted basis is $13.5 million, and because our applicable fraction, again, 100% affordable, is 100%, our qualified basis is $13.5 million. This is really all simple math. We now take our qualified basis, we multiply that by, in this case, the tax credit percentage, which is 9%, and that means that we have an annual tax credit that we can offer an investor of $1,215,000. And as the presentations advance, you'll understand what that means. Kelly is going to get into this in more detail. So right now, just understand that in order to pass through the credits to your investors, they have to become limited partners in a limited partnership or limited liability company that you're going to be creating. And they are going to own the project for 15 years and get the benefit of the tax credits over 10 years. Just let's leave it at that for right now. So what that means is since that's the way that you're going to pass through most, if not all, of the credits to the investors, you would have 12 million of the 12,150,000. You would have 12,148,000 in change to be able to offer to your investor. So what do they do? And I guess Paul will get into this in a little bit as well. They're going to look at that and come up with a discounted value of what that's worth today, what to put into your project to help you develop it. And when I say put that money into your project, that money will actually go in stages, and the stages that vary depending upon how the deal is structured. But a good portion of that money would actually go in during construction, and then part of that would be held back until you reach sustained or stabilized occupancy. So in this particular case, at 95 cents on the dollar, that would be the market price in this particular example, we could bring in over $11.5 million in equity into our $15 million project. So here's how we complete our capital stack. Total development cost, as I said, is $15 million. Tax credit equity is over $11.5 million, and you can see based on the percentage at 77%, that's a very significant amount of the total development cost. Right there, that should tell you why it's so valuable. This is a rule of thumb. I've just assumed in this case that we can only carry a conventional mortgage on the property of about $1.5 million. That would be 10% of the project. In some cases, it could be 10 to 20%. And the reason for that is you're actually setting your rents at a very low rate. They're not subsidized. The tenants are actually paying that rent, and it means that you have obviously fixed and variable operating expenses. So you cannot carry a large mortgage on these transactions. So in this particular example, we just said $1.5 million. Courtney will be getting into this as well in terms of developer fees, but in this particular instance, a deferred developer fee is part of the capital stack. The IRS allows you to take a 15% developer fee, but in this particular example, only 8% can be taken as a cash or non-deferred fee. So the balance, or that just over $1 million, actually becomes part of your capital stack because effectively you're deferring that fee. So you're not coming out of pocket, but it's equity that you're putting into the deal because you're deferring your fee and then ultimately have the ability to take that out of future cash flow. So that leaves, in this particular case, what we refer to in the industry as a funding gap. And that comes to $878,000 in change. And there are a variety, as a developer, our job is to then figure out where we're going to get that gap funding from. And there are a number of funding sources that you can tap into. Local home, federal home dollars, community development block grant funds. The Federal Home Loan Bank has an affordable housing program that's very competitive, but that can fill these types of gaps. So you can see we've assumed that we filled the gap with one or more funding sources, and our sources and uses now equal. Just very quickly, I'm going to go over the income and rent restrictions. There's two, and now the third set aside. The IRS says that you have to either set aside 20% of your units at 50% or less of the median income, or 40% of your units at 60% or less of the median income. there is the state that I work in, New Jersey, actually has a state will take those set-asides and say, for instance, if you elect to do 20% at 50, they will actually say you have to do 100% of your units at 50% of the median. Again, that's because that's a policy decision that they made. If you elect a 40 at 60, they will say, and the reason many developers choose that one over the other is because you can actually go in the tax credit program, you can set your rents up to a maximum of 60% of the area median income. And when you elect that set aside in New Jersey, they basically say, okay, but we also want you to set aside at least 10% of your units as very low income. Again, that's just a policy decision that they are making. So to establish your restricted rent, essentially you're looking at the median incomes for the area. You are you are assuming that a tenant or household or family cannot pay more than 30% of their income for total housing expenses. In a rental project, that's typically rent and utilities. So that's ultimately how you establish your rents, and then back into the set-asides that I just described. So let me just finish up by saying that this is, I think Sean said it best, this is really not a business for the faint-hearted, but there's tremendous opportunities. If you're going to step into this arena, you really need to have assemble a very experienced team, and that's everybody on your team. That's architect, engineer, contractor, property manager, attorneys, consultants, and you know, maybe the first key participants are your financial partners, obviously, because they're the ones that are going to, you know, make or break your project. But it's very, very critical in our experience not to retain people as part of your team and have them get up a learning curve. It's difficult enough for you to get up the learning curve, but it's not impossible. But if you surround yourself with the right expertise, it's all very doable. So I'm going to leave it at that.
All right, thank you, Stuart. And now we're going to switch gears over to Kelly to chat about the organizational structure of these types of transactions.
Sure. So, you know, the first point that I would make, which is sort of a fundamental principle of tax credits, is that you can't sell them. They're not property. They're not something that is a piece of paper that you can say, give me $100 and now you can go and put this on your tax return and take a tax credit. The IRS was very careful when they were creating the program to tie tax credits to ownership. So in order for an investor to be eligible to take a tax credit, they have to be an owner of the building. And, you know, after 1986, when the IRS really shut down a lot of the depreciation-oriented tax shelters, there were pretty complicated rules that were put into place that were intended to prevent individuals from benefiting from losses, basically, and tax credits. So what you find is, you know, if you can get through the labyrinth of rules and you're really a real estate professional for LIHTC purposes, which is different than in other real estate contexts, then yeah, maybe an individual can take the LIHTC, but it's highly unusual that an individual can get to that point. And, you know, if you do a lot of these deals, you know, how much income do you have to offset? So really, this is an industry where you've got C corporations, insurance companies, and big banks that are driven by CRA requirements that are the investors. So as a basic fundamental tenet, you know, you form an LLC or a partnership, and that LLC or the partnership owns the building, but you're going to have to admit a tax credit investor for 99.99%, basically in most situations, for as an owner of your LLC, and as it flows through as an owner of your property. Low-income housing tax credits are allocated in accordance with losses, so the same way that depreciation deductions are allocated. So I'm sort of skipping ahead to slide. So this is, I think, a baseline picture of what your structure would look like. So you're going to have your partnership or your limited liability company. The developer is going to have an affiliate that's serving as the managing member, and then you're going to have a tax credit investor that you're admitting to your partnership or LLC. There's a few different ways that you typically see these tax credit transactions structured in terms of your investors. You may see a direct investor, which is probably this one. And in this situation, you have, a bank or a corporation that's coming directly into your project. I sometimes see this with large banks. They'll do some direct investment. What I typically see is a syndication structure, which is Paul, and Paul will get into this more, but you'll see a financial intermediary that has a fund, and the financial intermediary, the syndicator, is basically putting together groups of investors. Either they could have a single investor, or they could have multiple investors. And the equity piece of this and negotiating the partnership agreement when you're doing these deals is sort of the critical aspect of getting the deal done. These partnership agreements tend to be a couple hundred pages. They're very complicated. They typically, the developer is the managing member and has traditional types of management rights on the one hand, but on the other hand, the investor has, a very significant number of rights in terms of approvals and, other aspects of the transaction. Typically what happens is the investor will put in somewhere around 20% of their equity at the initial tax credit closing. And then, there's other financing as Stuart was discussing. And then the remainder of the equity comes in over time, and it's based upon achieving certain developmental and operational milestones. And, Paul and Courtney will talk more about sort of the guarantees and different risks associated with the investments. But as a practical matter, there's significant negotiation that goes on about who are the guarantors, what are their net worth and liquidity requirements. You're typically guaranteeing operating deficits, which is different than other areas of real estate. The tax credits themselves, that you're actually going to deliver the amount of tax credits within the time frame that you've committed to do so. Development deficits, cost overruns, and at the end of the day, if you don't do what you say, the investor has pretty significant rights to either remove the managing member or require the managing member to repurchase their interests. So, these are very complicated negotiations, and I think, as everyone said on this panel, you want to have somebody that is very familiar with these types of arrangements, because they're very sort of market and industry driven. The other thing I will say is, if you're going to buy a building and you're going to use low-income housing tax credits, you need to have people that know about low-income housing tax credits before you buy the building. This is sort of the number one thing that I like to tell people that are getting in this industry, because, if you do not buy the building the right way, you may not have a deal. So if you're looking at a building and you're thinking this may be a good candidate for low-income housing tax credits, before you acquire the title, get the right people involved.
So I think next up we have, thank you, Kelly. Paul's going to jump into the, would you like to? Sure. Okay. chat about the risks involved in this business.
All right. So this is a very mature industry. There's quite a few developers, both for-profit and not-for-profit, who've been doing this for 20 plus years, and that's because it's a really, really strong industry. It provides affordable housing, and there's also an upside for a lot of developers who can do well by doing good. When we usually meet someone who's just starting in the development, they either own a site, or they own a building, or they want to buy a particular building to rehab, or they have access to a site, right? So that's who the developers that we're meeting, and they want to know what is the risk for them in doing this, and what's it going to cost for them to do it. And as Stu mentioned, it's a mature industry, so you're going to have to find out, can you get tax credits on these buildings? Building that you own, building that you're thinking about buying. If you're going to construct a new building, how's that going to work? So, when developers come to me, the first thing I say is you should first go to a consultant or an attorney to find out how viable this is. And we find a lot of them very interesting because where else can you go that you just have to pay some pre-development costs oftentimes and get equity? You're not paying this back. All you're doing is providing the tax credit that you either applied for or you earned because of the financing. So you're getting equity to build this. A lot of the deals I work on have absolutely no debt at all. So that alone makes it attractive to a lot of different groups. But if you are looking at it, one of the most common ones that we see these days are different developers looking at existing apartment buildings, often with Section 8, and they want to purchase these buildings, rehab them with the tax credits, because they don't want to use their own money, or it's the most efficient way to actually rehab these, and sell the tax credits to someone like me, and then own the building. And it's an excellent business model. We see it over and over again. The issue, probably the biggest issue these days, if you don't already own the building, is that there's a lot of really, really strong developers who have the same idea that you do. So these existing apartment buildings, particularly the ones with Section 8, are on the market for a nanosecond. The cap rates are rock bottom. And there's a lot of very, very sophisticated developers who are renovating these with tax credits. So the biggest barrier to entry, in my opinion, is putting together the money to act fast to purchase these buildings that you'd probably rehab with 4% tax credits. A lot of times, this is just what we're seeing in the market. The sellers don't care about financing contingencies. They don't care whether you have the tax credits already. They want you to act very quickly. So a lot of the developers I work with are looking for acquisition money. And that can be a big part of this, because the day that you identify the building that you want to buy, you're probably going to have to get it very quickly. The flip side is a lot of developers already have these properties, and that obviously makes it a lot easier. A lot of others will go to they'll compete for city-owned land or state-owned land. A lot of times that land, if you agree to make it affordable, you can access it for free. Once again, it's not easy. There's a lot of others who are competing to do that. And then, so if you've actually identified a site or a building that you think will work, what does it cost to actually put this together? Well, if you're going in for the tax credits, besides the acquisition costs, you're going to have to do some basics. You're going to have to get an appraisal and market study. You're going to have to hire a consultant to help you navigate the tax credit application process. You're going to have to hire an attorney. As Kelly mentioned, if you don't buy it in the partnership name, it's very problematic in the future. So New developers don't know that, but it's a big issue. And then you'll have to do some level of environmental work and architectural work before you bring it to your financing partner. Ballpark, it can cost $50,000 and up. Would you say that's correct?
So in some cases, it can be $250,000 and up.
So, and then once you've actually secured your tax credits, whether it's 4% or 9%, you're going to take them to the market. These tax credits, the 9% will probably pay for 70% of your building, more or less. 4% will pay for 30% of your building. You can't use these tax credits. You need the equity to do the construction, so you bring it to an investor or syndicator. And as Kelly mentioned, you're going to start a really long negotiation process. We're going to buy 99.99% of this property, so you're no longer going to own it. We're the limited partner. You're the general partner. But you're the managing person, so we're really kind of in the background, and you're the one who's going to be responsible for constructing this, renting it up, managing it, in accordance to all of the IRS rules. So as kind of not exactly a silent partner, but a not hands-on partner, we're gonna go through every single thing that could happen to this deal, and we're gonna duke it out, and we're gonna have a partnership agreement.
I would debate the hands-on comment.
What's that?
I would debate the hands-on comment.
Well, we could be hands-on, but we're gonna make sure that every aspect of this building, since we're not going to be there all the time, that you understand and we understand, and you've agreed that this is how it's going to operate. So you may be wondering what sort of guarantees you're going to provide to us. Usually, the biggest guarantees are a construction completion guarantee. You're going to guarantee that this building gets constructed. We're going to analyze you. We're going to make sure that you have the financial wherewithal in case that there's unexpected costs or costs go up. But at some point, if there is unexpected costs and we don't have any contingency left or we can't get more tax credits, it's on you. You're going to guarantee that the amount of tax credits that you've said you're going to sell to me, you're going to deliver those on time and as many as you said you're going to. What does that mean? If you have an allocation of tax credits, to me, I'm buying these tax credits. As you said, say it's $1 million for 10 years. So it's $10 million in tax credits. Say I buy it for 90 cents on the dollar. You have $10 million of tax credits. I'm giving you $9 million for those. You're going to use that $9 million to construct the building. You're not paying me back. You're using that $9 million. You're also going to pay your developer fee out of that. So I need something out of that. What I'm looking for is that those $1 million in tax credits come on time, the year that you said they would start, and you're going to get the full amount. And if you don't provide either of those, we're going to penalize you. And so there's always a lot of negotiation with that, but that's an important guarantee that you're going to provide. As was mentioned, you're also going to, at some level, guarantee that if there's any deficits in this building, in the operations, you'll make good on that. And then there's two that I'm not really going to go into. It's called the recapture and repurchase, but it's very specific to the industry. And then finally, you'll guarantee that if there's any sort of environmental issues with the building, you're going to indemnify us. So, it's a little bit tax credit 202, but, for the pricing, what would you expect to get if you had an allocation of $1 million in tax credits for 10 years? I previously said, you could say 90 cents, so you'd get $9 million roughly for your building. But that can vary. And what does that depend on? It depends on your reputation as a developer. It depends on the location of the building. It depends on whether there's CRA needs for different investors. I don't know if people are familiar with the CRA, but that's an incentive for large banks to invest in certain areas in order to stay in the government's good graces. So sometimes they're very motivated to invest in LIHTCs in certain areas, and they're willing to pay premiums. It depends on how quickly I put my money in. If you use this tax credit money for construction, so I'm putting a lot in during construction, obviously your price is much lower. If you're able to defer it and say, look, I'll get a loan or I'll use other sources to build the building, and then you can retire all those other sources, once the building is all leased up, then you get a higher price. And that's something that we just negotiate. It's time cost of money. So that's, those are kind of some of the factors that go into the LIHTC pricing. Right now, at the low end, you'd probably see something in the mid to high 80s. In New York City, believe it or not, you're going to get more than $1 for $1 in tax credits. As counterintuitive as that sounds, as stupid as that sounds, it's actually true. For the $1 in tax credits you could sell me, you could actually get $1.02. And how does that happen? Because we're buying the losses as well. Since we own 99.99% of the building that you actually own, we are also taking the losses. So when we sell these in funds, what we're doing is we're buying tax credits from several developers. We're taking those, we're putting them in a fund of $200 million or $250 million, and then we're selling it off to institutional investors. So they're not only taking all of these tax credits from you, they're also taking the losses. And so it can be a little bit more. And some of them are very motivated due to the Community Redevelopment Act. So you can count on anywhere from 85 to, only in New York City, probably above $1.
If you're in a jurisdiction that requires a verification code, please write the following code word down. There. THERE. There.
All right, thanks, Paul. So if you get, we're just kind of on a time. If we can, I would love to hear all the questions. If we could just save it towards the end. If you guys aren't scared off by all the guarantees that you have to sign up, well, the whole reason why we even get into the business, Courtney's going to cover the benefits of the LIHTC program.
Great.
Oh yeah. That's
so I said to Sean, I feel like I get the best job here on the panel. I get to talk about all the happy, good stuff. If we haven't been scared away from the complexity that we learned about from Stuart and Kelly, or from the risks that we learned about from Paul. There are reasons that people do these deals, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what those reasons are. So there are developer fees. We've talked a little bit, everyone's kind of mentioned developer fees, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what that is and how you can think about sizing it. There's also cash flow from these buildings. There is sometimes sale proceeds if it's a refinancing. And then there's just the good feeling of when you go to sleep at night that you've actually built affordable housing. It's not all about the money. We actually are building housing for people that are in need. So the developer fee. So the developer fee is the main incentive to do a deal like this. It is meant to profit incentivize developers to do an affordable deal versus a market rate deal, and to repay them for their time and the expenses of putting a deal together from the point of like identifying a site to loan closing. So Stuart mentioned kind of the Bible of the tax credit world, which is the qualified allocation plan, and that is each agency is required by the IRS to develop their own qualified allocation plan, and there's a lot of strict rules that are federally imposed through the IRS. But there's wiggle room, and there's spaces where the agencies that get those tax credit allocations can decide for themselves how they want their program, their specific agency program, to work. And one of those things is around the formula of how to derive the developer fee. And in New York here, generally, there's multiple agencies in New York that you could get their financing through, your tax credits through, but generally that formula is equal to 10% of the acquisition cost and somewhere between 12 and 15% of most of the expenses in the deal, so the hard cost and the soft cost, except for some things like reserves. So that sizes to a pretty hefty number. So just for an example, there was a deal that I worked on that was a $4 million purchase price. This was actually a nonprofit. They got a really good deal, on a New York City site, and it cost them $33 million for hard and soft costs to do the deal. So that $4 million purchase price, 10% of it, that's $400,000 on the acquisition part of the developer fee, and that $33 million of additional costs, they got 12%, I think, so that was $3.9 million. So that's a developer fee of $4.3 million. That is profit to the developer who's putting the deal together. And that is the reason why, anyone who's in this business is in this business. However, you don't leave the closing with a check for $4.3 million. There are some constraints around this. So Stuart mentioned this in his remarks, that while you're putting the deal together, if your uses are greater than your sources and you have a gap and you're looking for ways to fill it, the agency will expect that your first go-to gap filler is to defer some of your fee. And they will absolutely expect it, and they will expect you to maximize how much of that fee you can defer before you come to them and say, I need some kind of subsidy loan that I'm not going to pay back, or I need some other gap filler, or I need something else. You absolutely need to come to them and say, I'm willing to defer a lot of my fee before they'll pony up additional money. That fee is sized based on cash flow. And so your tax credit syndicator, like Paul, is going to want to know that that deferred fee can be paid back during the period of time that they're involved in the deal, which is the 15 years. And so you're going to look at how much cash flow you have over a 15-year period and then use that to size how much of your developer fee you can afford to defer and help make your deal work. So this is just an example of like a deal where you can the main thing I just want you to see here is net cash flow. All of it is going towards the deferred developer fee until you have been repaid for that deferred developer fee. So you're going to get some of that deferred developer fee, and Paul's going to get some of that deferred developer fee. But you need to make sure that you can earn it back and earn it back within those 15 years. So the amount of the fee that you don't have to defer is called your paid developer fee. And that's paid to you, some at closing and some of it at construction milestones and at lease-up milestones. And so that's the money that drives the check that you leave with the day of the closing. You need to use some of that fee to pay some of the sources of funds. So the agencies don't allow you, and the IRS doesn't allow you always to capitalize all of the costs. So for instance, in New York right now, a lot of the reserves need to be funded from the developer fee. This is like a new thing, like 10 years ago. It wasn't a requirement. They were all capitalized expenses, and now the city is saying we want this to be funded from your fee. Other costs, like the consultants that we're talking about in New York, depends on the state. In Washington, those costs can be capitalized. In New York City, New York State, you cannot capitalize those fees. They have to come out of your developer fee. I'm going backwards for some reason. There we go. So just to give you a for instance, this was a deal that had a developer fee of $12.6 million. 4.4 of it had to be deferred to make the deal work. So the paid fee was $8 million, pretty good. Of that $8 million, $1.8 million of it had to be used to capitalize reserves. $200,000 of it was used to pay what's called an owner's rep, which is someone that's often hired to help advocate for the developer during the construction phase and make sure that their contractors aren't taking advantage of them and they're on site and they're your eyes and ears kind of on the ground and approving and reviewing all change orders. An important member of the team, and that their fee, at least in New York, needs to be paid out of your developer fee. Oftentimes you might want to hire cost estimators to make sure that your contractors, again, are giving you real legitimate pricing. Those fees also need to come out of the developer fee. So now, when you net out the costs that need to get paid up from the developer fee, you're looking at a net developer fee not of $12.6 million, but of $10 million. Still not bad. And your paid developer fee went from $8 million to $6 million. Again, not so bad to walk away with $6 million. So now, after your deferred developer fee has been paid back, there's cash flow. And this cash flow, the waterfall, is negotiated with Paul, with your tax credit syndicator, on who gets what from this cash flow and in what order, and all that is going to be laid out and negotiated for you and papered by Kelly in your operating agreement or your limited partnership agreement. And this is just to show you, this is from one of those operating agreements. You can see, we don't need to read every line, but this is just to show you, this is the waterfall. So this is, if there's cash flow, it goes first to an asset management fee, second to fund an operating reserve, third. And there are all of these ways that your cash flow needs to be spent before it can go into your pocket, because there's lots of different entities involved and requirements from the lenders and from your tax credit syndicators. The third kind of financial benefit is if you already own the asset and you're refinancing it, then that acquisition cost, which you are going to get as the seller of the property, it can be used for different things. It can be used to pay off any current debt that you have on the property. It can also be used if you have a troubled property. If you have a troubled property where you haven't been able to earn back your deferred developer fee because the cash flow isn't there, when you do the refinancing, you can earn back that deferred fee through the acquisition price. If you have expense payables, if you've personally had to make advances or your company's personally had to make advances to the property, all those can get repaid through the acquisition price. And then the last thing is just a reminder that this is housing for people who need affordability. Generally accepted definition of affordability is if you're paying more than 30% of your income towards your housing costs. And just some interesting stats, in 2017, half of New York City renters were paying more than that 30% of their income towards rent, and 1 in 4 homeowners in New York City are paying more than 30%. So all of those people need more affordable housing. It's a huge number, and that number is just going up in New York. And low-income housing tax credits is the main driver to create housing for that population of people. That's it.
All right, so bringing it all together, there might be people in the audience that have an underperforming asset, whether that's a vacant land that is clipping real estate taxes and you're thinking of converting it to affordable housing, or potentially with the new rent regulation laws, and if there's stabilized units that could be potentially a candidate for an affordable housing asset in New York City, or whether that's a hotel someone may own that they're looking to convert to senior housing, for example, that's not profitable at the moment. So there's different ways to leverage the low-income housing tax credit subsidy source, and everyone here on the panel would love to help or answer any questions. So before we open it up to questions, we'd like to just thank the Riverside Experience, Mark Feld and Ben Myers, for putting this whole thing together. So, and with that, we'll start with the first question. I did.
So basically, you get $8 million, you get nailed on taxes, right? So you don't get any tax benefits as the operator of the building, right? You own 21% of the building. So all the tax appreciation of the building goes to the owner of the tax credit, the guy who owns 99.9%. Okay. So, yeah, that's a good fee, but it's not a good tax credit. Definitely a good fee.
Yeah, we need an accountant on the panel for
Well,
that.
I would just say, did you want to?
Yeah, and that's true. And I think the other thing I would point out is the deferred developer fee. And the developer fee is ordinary income. It doesn't generate capital income.
So just to repeat the question, it was it's not a good. This business is not a good tax deferral or tax depreciation program for the general partner, the developer who puts all the pieces together. So I just had one thought on top of that. It was, if you really look at it though, the developer is putting $0 of their own equity into the entire project when it's all said and done. So from a tax perspective, you're okay giving the depreciation and the losses over to Paul in the syndication shop, because you're in it for nothing. So you're on the hook for the guarantees, but you're really in it for nothing. So, which is different than a traditional market rate investment where you really do need to put real equity of your own into the deal. So, it kind of answers your question in some ways. Okay, sure. So the question is recapture and repurchase of the tax credit. So, Paul, do you want to? I'm sorry?
99.9% goes to you. After 15 years, where does the developer come out of this?
Do you want to go?
Certainly. So in year 15, so the tax credits are 10 years, so I got to be in there for at least 10 years, right? Because every year we want those 10 years of tax credits. The government has said there's going to be an additional 5 years, which I'm on the hook if something goes wrong. So I have to stay as your partner for 15 years, even though I'd like to be out after 10. The government has mandated 15. So in year 15, at the very we're gonna exit. I want out. I've got what I got. I got what I needed out of there. I don't want to stay in this any longer. And at the very beginning of this deal, we're going to negotiate something on the terms of my exit, how this is going to happen. And that's we could negotiate that for a very long time, But there's a lot of standard ways in which that's done. It depends whether there's a not-for-profit involved. But we will have a strategy in the limited partnership agreement which will spell out how we are going to determine how this is sold between us.
Paul, let me just ask you this question. Would you say that the industry has gone from the early days of investors really looking for residual value as opposed to today where they're really looking more for an exit strategy that would cover their cost to exit the partnership and have their developers assume the existing debt, or are you seeing a combination of that?
We're seeing a combination. Obviously, if there's a big upside to this building, we'd like to be a part of it. But a lot of these developers are very sophisticated, and they're not, and they're gonna minimize that for me if I want. I don't automatically get the deal as much as I'd like to tell you that right away. You're going to go to different syndicators, and you're going to pick the one that gives you, in your opinion, the best deal, right? And part of that will be the different strategies they give you in year 15. Some of these buildings that were done in certain areas several years ago, 15 years later, there's actually a lot of work to these buildings. So, in the early days, there wasn't a lot of we didn't really spell this out very clearly, and it got very convoluted. But developers are very sophisticated, and now they know, and they really try to minimize how much of the upside I'm going to get, and they're mostly going to try to get it for yourself, which we understand. What's that? Real estate taxes? The real estate taxes, a lot of these deals have paid real estate taxes. Some of them by nature, because they're affordable, they pay lower real estate taxes. Yeah, some of them, they have pilots. There's different ways in which the real estate taxes are assessed, depending on the municipality, depending on what you've negotiated.
Kelly's got to catch a train, so you can if you want to head out. We can continue answering questions, but she's just got to run. So let's thank her.
I can add a little bit more about the real estate taxes. So the way that these deals are set up, most of them are entitled to some form of a tax abatement, which is part of the process of kind of when we think about gap filling and we think about putting the financing together. Is I've never seen a tax credit deal without some form of a real estate tax abatement as well. It's just like leaving money on the table to not include that.
So I think we had one question here.
You mentioned before that there's certain guarantees that the developer has to provide in connection with compliance. Are those personal guarantees? To what extent does the developer have to more of a financial capacity? They're obviously not being counted on to provide any equity, but I imagine they're providing some sort of guarantees. And if there is any recourse component, if there are any, what are the tax credits indicators would be look at the developer?
So to repeat the question, what are the guarantees? There's guarantees that are required. What's the liquidity net worth requirements from the guarantor? Even though they don't need to put real money into the deal, they obviously need to have some sort of financial capacity. So, Paul, you want to tell us what you like from a developer?
Everything's negotiable. We're looking for someone who has some wherewithal. We don't want to do someone who has 43 cents to their name, because if there's a problem, that person can't stand behind it. But depending on how the deal is structured, we can look at several different ways on how much liquidity, how much net worth you have. I would say, and just take this with a grain of salt, a lot of times they say $1 million in liquidity and $5 million in net worth. But that is definitely, a huge deal that we may want more. If there's different risk factors, we may want more. And if there's other risk factors, we may settle for less.
Sure.
I was just curious, oftentimes affordable housing happens with a JV, with a charity or a non-for-profit, which is tax exempt. I wanted to understand how that plays in case lending.
So the question is, there's JV structures with nonprofits and the general partner seat is what you're asking, and how does PACE funding fall into that? How does the PACE funding fall into the capital stack? So I'm not a PACE expert, but what I understand is, isn't it a tax liability?
So it's an off-balance sheet and it belongs to the building, not the owner, so it gets paid before tax.
Right. So I would say it's senior to all debt. I don't mean to answer the question here, but so if it's it'd be senior to even your first position debt, and being senior to your first position debt, it would also be senior to your equity, so your tax credit equity as well. So if you can get a PACE loan, I don't know if a PACE loan has been done on a tax credit development. I'm not aware of, but okay.
So concerning developer fees, so you said it's 10 to 12% of the total acquisition for the hard and soft costs. So what's stopping you from jacking up my hard and soft costs with just installing the best finishes and the best amenities, just so that that way I can get more tax credits? Isn't it in my best incentive?
Yeah. Oh. Thanks for the reminder. So the question was, if the developer fee is a percent of the total development cost, why wouldn't I just jack up the total development cost to inflate my developer fee? The constraint there is to have a deal that works, right? Like, these deals are very expensive to do. There are a lot of fees that you're going to pay to Paul. There are a lot of fees that you're going to pay to the bond issuer that's issuing the loans that are associated with the tax credits. There are a lot of fees, and so these deals are expensive on their own without inflating them to be even more than what they are in reality. And so just the constraint of wanting to get your sources and your uses to match is going to limit how much you can really juice that up. However, how much money you spend is tied to your equity, right? So there is not really a strong incentive for your general contractor to come in under budget, because you want to spend that money that you've put into the budget, because your investor is expecting you to spend that money to earn credits that are associated with those expenses to get the equity. So there is this perverse incentive of you want to actually spend your whole hard cost budget. And I've worked on some deals where my general contractor is just like, I've saved all this money. And I'm like, no. What else can we build? Do we need a gazebo? What do we need on site? Because we're going to spend that money because we need to for the equity investor.
Let me just add to that. So in my state, we have to operate, and it's like this in many states. You have to operate under certain development cost caps. So all of your costs are going to really be scrutinized by the agencies that are looking at this, and not just total development costs, but also the construction costs. So there's going to be that smell test or that reasonableness test. And to Courtney's point, because the best situation that you can be in is that if you finish a job and you've actually saved money or haven't really used your contingency or a very small portion of your contingency. At that point in time, you're going to want to spend your contingency, and that's okay. I mean, you might say, well, why can't I pocket that? That's because you're operating under a governmental program, and there are certain requirements that you have to meet. But once you get through all those hoops, and I think Courtney identified this very well, is there are a lot of benefits. But you have to play ball.
So just a third point. So you want to make the project as efficient as possible before you close on the deal and before things move forward, because it's not beneficial. In rare cases it is, but it's not beneficial to just jack up more costs, because you're not getting enough equity into the project as you are costs. So, but then, as Courtney was saying, once you've baked the deal, you want to just stand the course and follow. You don't want to go over budget or under budget. So, to kind of bring it all together. Sure.
I had two questions. One was, it was regarding New York City. I've been told by people that the ratings for LIHTC tax credits are tremendous. At least 2 years. So I wanted to ask about the availability of tax credits in New York City particularly. Second question was, what happens to the rents at the end of year 2?
Okay, so first question is, there's a wait list for getting for developers getting allocated tax credits in the city of New York. And the second one is, what happens to the rents after the 15-year period is finished. So do you want to take that one?
Yeah, that from what I've found, that rumor is true. With city deals, city tax credits, there is about a 2-year wait right now to do a tax credit deal through the city. However, we also have a state agency, and generally the division is along geographic lines, that if you're in the city, HPD and HDC are going to finance your deal, and if you're upstate or outside of the 5 boroughs, it's going to be the state HCR. However, it's not always the case. And, I had a deal that looked really great, and I talked to HPD about it recently and said, okay, but really timing, and they're like, yeah, it really is 2 years. And I was like, what are you telling to people then? Like, what are my other options? And they're like, go to our sister agency, go talk to the state. It doesn't always break down on geographic lines. Like, this was a site in New York City. And they have a much shorter waiting list right now for tax credit deals. So you just have to kind of explore all your options.
So in terms of what happens at the end of the 15-year compliance period, in all likelihood, because of other factors in terms of how it's going to be financed, and that the IRS and allocating agencies would require what's called extended compliance, most likely you're going to have those units deed restricted for 30 years or more. I mean, it's going to be typically it would be coterminous with your mortgage. It would also be coterminous with the term of your tax abatement. That doesn't mean that you are restricted from selling the property, but clearly because of those extended compliance requirements and through the deed restriction, those units will have to remain affordable for that extended period of time.
We got a question in the back. So the question is, what's the enforcement mechanism for the next 15 years? Meaning on the rent restrictions that are required by the allocating agency, right? So I'm happy to answer that. So there's going to be a use agreement recorded against title on the property. So you can't just decide you want to rent it at market levels, because if you do, the state agency is most probably going to come after you for the use agreement that they have against your property.
And then your tax credit syndicator, like Paul, could have their tax credits recaptured. Oh, after the 15 years.
Sure. So we'll do one more question and then wrap up here, because I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So go for it.
So it's two questions. One for Paul. I was wondering, have you ever dealt with a situation where GP's basis increased over time, like as the credits were paid out? And the second question was for Stuart. I know you mentioned that the first mortgage was difficult to get on one of these properties. Is that because of the deferred development fee, or was that something else?
So your question was, has your basis ever gone up during construction? And
Rather, as tax credits are paid out. So, as you get your tax credits, the basis increases.
I don't think so. I mean, we as the tax credits start going through, as we're taking them every year, I don't think your basis would increase.
So I think the only because the GP is taking like 0.01%, they're also getting allocated a very insignificant amount of losses to the GP seat. So usually their capital account is decreasing, but if there's a situation where they need to the investor comes up and you didn't do something right as the general partner and you need to put money into the property, usually it's in the form of a note, but if it's an equity to the project, that would be the only way that I would see it, capital account going up.
I'm just thinking that as like kind of a loan way, and you're repaying it through tax credits.
You'd repay it through cash. If you have to loan money to the deal after it's constructed, you'd repay it through cash flow.
So the equity that they're investing, they're repaying over time before the tax credits.
We're taking the tax credits and you're not repaying it.
And their capital account is being decreased by the losses that are being generated. So it's not the tax credits and the actual true equity that's in the capital account they don't really have a relationship with each other. And then I think there was another.
I think your second question was why would it be difficult to obtain the mortgage in the example that I gave? Well, it's not that it's difficult to obtain the mortgage. It's just that these developments don't cannot carry a sizable mortgage based on the fact that you have restricted rents. So in the example that I gave, it was 10% of the total development cost. Now, and that would be on a 9%, say, ground-up new construction deal. Some of the projects that Paul was referring to, the 4%, the large-scale 4% acquisition rehab projects that have all existing Section 8 contracts, actually can carry a very sizable mortgage, and it's really with that very large mortgage and the 4% tax credit equity, which again yields you less than half the 9%, you effectively can meet your all of your uses. So your acquisition costs, which would be very substantial, your rehab costs, which can be substantial, and all your other costs of development.
So I'm happy to stick around. I don't know about the rest of the panelists here to answer any other questions. So want to be respectful of everybody's time. Thank you guys for coming out, and cheers.